In this podcast episode, we want to introduce you to our BCEN friend, Lionel Lyde. Come along as Michael Dexter and Holly Briggs talk with Lionel about his career in military nursing and leadership. He will discuss his current focus, improving access to healthcare for low-income populations. This episode is called, "This is the Way of Nursing."
Hello, and welcome to the BCEN Friends podcast, where we hold interesting conversations about learning with a range of thought leaders, BCN certification holders, and industry professionals. But most importantly, to create value and insight for you, our professional nurses across the emergency spectrum. We hope you find our discussions interesting, informative, sometimes funny, sometimes serious, and always valuable. I'm Holly Briggs, a professional development specialist at BCN, and one of your hosts for today. I'm joined by my co-host, Michael Dexter, Director of Professional Development at BCN. Hi, Michael.
Hello, Holly. Good to be with you again.
Good to be with you. In this episode of BCN Friends, we have Lionel Lyde. Lionel is an emergency nurse who served in both the Army and the Air Force. It's not something you hear often. He has stories for days, and I am certainly wanting to give him as much time to share with us while we have him on this podcast. So without further details from me, Michael, could you please introduce us to our BCN friend, Lionel?
Yeah, I'm really happy to. And, as you said, he has quite an extensive background, and I don't feel like my introduction could do justice to all that he's done, but certainly very honored to have Lionel Lyde with us today. He's a retired military nurse with 35 years of service in the armed forces, which includes 10 years in the Army and 25 years in the Air Force. He holds his master's in healthcare administration and master's in business administration and is a certified emergency nurse. Lionel has taken on clinical, leadership, and executive leadership positions during his 31-year nursing career, spending most of his clinical time as a critical care and ER trauma nurse. His last position being an Air Force critical care master clinician and special military consultant to the Air Force Surgeon General for critical care nursing. We'll discuss more of his military career later, but at one point, as master clinician, he advised group leadership on nursing issues and guided practice and training of 161 personnel, delivering care to 55 inpatient beds. And he ensured the delivery of high reliability patient care to over 10,000 active duty and 92,000 eligible beneficiaries. He retired from military service as a colonel in 2022, but is certainly not retired from nursing. He's currently the director of nursing for a group home and manages a free clinic. His current professional goal is to network primary care clinics that provide care to low-income and indigent patient populations. This goal is part of a greater aspiration to facilitate access to the healthcare system and decompress community emergency departments. Lionel, welcome to the BCN and Friends podcast. It is a pleasure to have you with us today.
Michael and Holly, thank you for having me today. It's my pleasure to be joining you.
Yeah, well, we're excited to get to know more about you and talk about your career. And like I said, I feel like I can't do justice to all that you've done. First of all, thank you for your military service and congratulations on retiring from the military. And, you've been in places from Florida to Korea, Baltimore to Afghanistan, many more all around the world. Tell us a little bit about why you went into nursing and kind of that whole journey that's brought you to where you are today. You have quite a list of accomplishments.
Well, thank you, Michael. My journey in nursing actually started when I joined the military, when I enlisted in the Army back in 1986. I was a medical laboratory technician, and I came into the military to get more money to go back to school. So it was my intention when I joined the military to gain the benefit of being able to complete college, because that was my goal. And while I was taking some courses, some undergraduate courses when I was enlisted, I realized during an accounting course, I was doing pretty well. Typically, most military bases have an education center where you have your classes. All the rooms were booked. They moved us over to the cath lab. There was a theater at the old Walter Reed on Georgia Avenue in Washington, D.C. We're in the theater. We're having our accounting class. They're running a heart cath on the screen behind the instructor. I'm not paying attention to the instructor. I'm looking at this heart cath and I'm naming off the chambers and the valves and everything. And at that moment, I realized I think I need to change my major. I was previously a biology major, but now I was into something else. And when I changed my major, I said, I'm going to take an intro to nursing class. It had a clinical at a nursing home. I took the class, did the clinical. at the end of the clinical, and I realized that that was my purpose. Nursing was my purpose. And I decided at that point I was going to be a registered nurse.
So, do you think somebody from the nursing school purposely put that cath image up on the background to recruit some more people like yourself? Or
Well, everything happens for a reason. And I think it was the universe telling me where I needed to be. And every nursing class that I was in, it felt effortless. Yes, I did have to study, but it felt effortless, as if I was supposed to be there. And I went to the University District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. So a lot of my clinicals were in the D.C. area. And it was a very rigorous program, and I felt very prepared upon graduation. And it was a program that was supported by the U.S. Army. So when I finished school, I got commissioned as a second lieutenant.
So tell me a little bit more about how you went from that into being on a CCAT team, or being, to advising the Air Force Surgeon General. Like a little bit more of how you got into some of these other roles within military medicine.
After graduating from nursing school, I owed the Army 4 years. So I did the 4 years in the Army, and then the Army had a reduction in force at that time. And a lot of the nurses that graduated from the Army program, we had a couple of options: severance and separate, or we had the option to join another branch of the service. The chief of the Air Force Nurse Corps sent out a memorandum saying, hey, we know you guys are leaving. We know you have military training. Would you consider the Air Force? And at the time, it was a time of transition in my life. I was like, you know what? I'll try the Air Force. I'll give them 4 years. If I don't like it, I'll go back to working at a hospital here in town, and that's what I'll do. I joined the Air Force as a critical care nurse, and my first assignment was at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida on the Gulf Coast. It was a very good assignment, and from there, I went to Korea. That's where I ended up in the emergency department, because they didn't have critical care nurses at the hospital in Korea, because it was a contingency hospital should the North invade the South and all those other things. And it was just slow enough for me to learn emergency nursing. Part of it was I met my wife at the first assignment. She was working med-surg. I was working on the ICU. And we ended up in Korea at the same time. Now, we weren't married yet. Then we got married in Korea. She was supposed to go to the emergency department at Andrews Air Force Base. I was supposed to go to the ICU. She went into the reserve. We had the same last name. Somebody called over to Korea and said, hey, we're looking for Captain Lyde. I was like, which one do you want? And when they asked for her, I told her she had went into the reserve. And they asked me, would you be interested in working in the emergency department? And I said no. But when I got to Andrews Air Force Base, my chief nurse let me know, because I went to go see her to try to get my assignment changed to another section of the hospital, to the ICU. She said, you're going to work in the emergency department. So I'm a captain. She's a colonel. I followed the directions. Got to the emergency department. It was very busy, and I was working triage. There was a certification reference manual in the triage room. And I was in there one day, and it wasn't busy. So I started reading it. And I was like, you know what? Let me dive into emergency nursing more. And we had, again, robust clinical experiences, gunshot wounds, pediatric codes, precipitous deliveries, everything that was in that certification manual. And I began to read it. I said, you know what? I think that I'm going to certify myself as an emergency nurse, because it was a thing that I didn't want to do, but it turned out that it ended up being something that I really, really enjoyed. I just adapted to it. And while I was there, because I also had the critical care identifier, I was placed on a CCAT team for deployment. Then I received training at Brooks Air Force Base in Texas to prepare for CCAT. And that was early days of CCAT. During the training, I realized that I was able to bring together my emergency nursing skills and my critical care skills at the same time, because we're in an austere environment with very few resources. Then that first deployment was CCAT. And what I liked about it was the nature of it's myself, the physician, and an RT. We're in this environment and we're carrying everything with us. We have our ventilators, our pumps, fluid, everything that we need, in conjunction to working with the AirVac flight crew. And we're providing care for patients. from A to B. And these are very critically ill patients. So to me, it was fulfilling because I was enhancing the survival rate of military members coming from the battlefield. Because during the Vietnam era, a lot of injured service members did not make it home. But since then, we improved the survival rate to about 97% because we have a system in place that allows us to transport critically ill patients from a field environment or contingency hospitals to larger hospitals in Germany, stabilize them some more, and then bring them over to the States, to one of our larger military medical centers to continue their treatment. These service members that were seriously injured, that were engaged in combat, deserve to go home alive. So if it was possible, I was going to try to make that possible. Now, I understand that everybody will not make it due to the seriousness of their injuries, but fortunately enough, during any of our transports, we didn't lose anyone, and we made sure that they got to the next level of care safely. Now, fast forwarding, after I came back from that deployment, I was given the opportunity at the R. Adams Cowley Shock Trauma Center in Baltimore. There was a program in the Air Force called the Centers for Sustainment of Trauma and Readiness Skills. And it was they needed a critical care nurse to work at this trauma center to be an instructor. It was a program to train military members on trauma prior to deployment. It was a very, very busy environment. I call it the Super Bowl because we saw everything every day. The way the facility was set up, there were helipads on the roof. The elevator went straight downstairs to the resuscitation unit, from the resuscitation unit to the OR, from the OR to the ICU or wherever else they were going. So normally an assignment is 3 to 4 years. I had the opportunity to stay for a 5th year. And those 5 years were, I would say, a turning point for myself in nursing, because I was around world-class physicians and some of our nurse leaders and educators that have contributed immensely to the field of nursing in terms of trauma resuscitation, and even what happens post-trauma. So having, once again, both set of skills honed, I would say a total of over 1,000 doctors, nurses, PAs, special operations medics came through our program. And we use a lot of simulation. We put teams together, team building simulation. They hit the simulator the first day so they could realize where they were. And then we would just slow roll them through clinical rotations and lectures to the point that when we put them in a simulator at the end of the course, they were able to function effectively as a team. So we were teaching the dance of trauma. And that was very rewarding. And I had the opportunity to also hire some staff and bring in advanced practice nurses, acute care nurse practitioners into the program just to elevate the bar. And I had a subsequent assignment after that to Langley Air Force Base, where I was in charge of 2 inpatient units, a med-surg unit and a small ICU. And I remember my wife telling me, they know who you are because you taught in the program for 5 years. You're going to get another deployment. And I was like, sure. Well, within a year of being there, I got another deployment. I was attached to an Army Forward Surgical Team as an ATLS augmentee. We were at a small facility. We had a 3-bed trauma bay. We had an OR and an ICU recovery. Once again, emergency nursing skills come into play in the trauma bay. And then I would have to move from the trauma bay to the ICU recovery. So having both sets of skills really came in handy. And you name it, we did it. But the turning point was that emergency department job at Andrews Air Force Base and becoming an emergency nurse. What I did, I passed my CEN examination right before I deployed. And I met a promotion board, and I had to make sure I got it in my record. But it was a personal goal for me because I was an ICU nurse that successfully transferred to the ER, and it adjusts your mindset in terms of the resuscitations, the transports. In Korea, I spent a lot of time on helicopters. Whenever we needed to transport somebody to the Army hospital in Seoul, I would request a dust off, and I would ride on the Army Black Hawk with the patient to the Army hospital. So yeah, taking that one assignment to Korea and the following assignment to the emergency department were turning points in my career.
It's awesome that you can look back on that and see some really pivotal moments, whether that be you're sitting in a lecture watching something happen on a cath lab screen and going, "Huh, that looks really interesting. I think that could be something." Or it be I'm in the ER and I didn't know if I really wanted to be here. And yet there's this book and it's talking about being certified in emergency nursing. And maybe while I'm deployed, I'm going to do some transport things. I'm taking these steps to just challenge myself, expand my comfort zone. I think that just speaks a lot to your character and why you've had such an extensive career that's expanded so many specialties in nursing and has really just culminated to where you are now and the things that you're doing now. We're going to jump into that. But I did want to ask because, again, you've had both civilian and you've had those forward deployments in healthcare environments that are so very different from one another. A couple of crossovers, but mostly very different. What would you say is kind of the biggest challenges for each one? So being in that civilian hospital and then being in that forward deployed, where would you say the greatest challenges were for each?
The greatest challenges, I'll start with the military. The simulations are stressful on purpose to prepare you to think in a very noisy, chaotic environment. However, there's an order to the chaos. And if you stick to your assessment skills and you keep things head to toe and you pay attention to your ABCs, then you can focus on what needs to be done. But you have limited resources. That's because if you're on an aircraft, you have what you have with you, and equipment does fail. So you have to fall back on some of those manual nursing skills, getting a watch with a sweep hand and working with that stopcock to get the drip rate because your pump has failed or the battery. So you learn to be somewhat of a MacGyver, I would say. There's a lot of problem solving involved, and your primary objective is to ensure the survival of this patient. So you have to understand these things and work with the equipment that you have to ensure the best outcome for your patients. On the civilian side, understanding the physical environment. When I say the physical environment, there are supplies, there are charges for bags of fluid and those type of things. You also have to understand the hierarchies that exist within the facilities. The turnover as far as leadership may be a little slower in the civilian facility because you have leadership that may have been in place for years. However, there's a benefit to that because there's a wisdom that comes with being in a facility for 20 years. And you can receive that wisdom and mentorship from the leadership and from the staff. When I was at the Shock Trauma Center, we were a military unit embedded in a civilian facility. A lot of times there may have been some, I would say misunderstanding, but there was some re-education to understand why we were there. And one of the managers got it. She said, "My nephew is in the Army. He's in Iraq. So by welcoming you and working with you, I'm ensuring the survival of my nephew." So understanding the physical constraints, understanding budget, staff. Why can't you guys get any overtime? And then you learn to understand these things when you work with the management, being included as part of the team and understanding what a civilian facility has to endure in order to deliver care to patients. Just the healthcare system itself can be quite a hill to climb. But once you understand those things, you can work within the system.
Well, you've certainly gone into some good tips for for navigating, especially for people that are looking into maybe a leadership role or something. And one of the other things that you have done is you've interviewed a lot of people. Yeah, I think we mentioned that you interviewed over 100 nurses who are candidates for the Air Force Nurse Corps. And so when you're looking at what I would say maybe a good candidate or a qualified candidate, I don't know how to justify that better, but what sets somebody apart when they're interviewing? What's maybe a go-to question that you asked a lot of people, or what's something that you were looking for as a leader in some of these other nurses that really gave them a foot up in the interview process?
Well, understanding first, having been a preceptor, having taught multiple life support courses, understanding the structured development of nurses that occurs in the Air Force. And when you sit down with young nurses, because there were times I had to sit in for my chief nurse executive. So when you have a new nurse come in, you discuss, welcome to the facility, their background, and then you talk about, okay, fine, let's look at a 30-year timeline. What are your goals? What do you want to do? And you start talking to these individuals now as a consultant, because eventually, I know you'd asked me that question previously, on a tail end, near the end of my career, I became a special military consultant to the Air Force Surgeon General for critical care nursing. And part of my job was the acquisition of critical care nurses. True, they saw the recruiters and the paperwork was done, but the recruiters weren't medical people. So it came down to my interview. What do I look for? Well, first, I would ask them, well, why do you want to join the military? What do you know about the Air Force? Because I wanted to make sure that they'd done their homework. You want to make sure that people understand what they're getting into. Number two, my interviews were scenario-based. So I had scenarios that were based on experiences that I had, or I would read their resume before. Everybody got the same scenario, but it was tailored. And it seemed to be algorithm-driven, because if you couldn't understand systemic vascular resistance when somebody is on a pressor, then this is what would happen next. So I would see how they would react in the situations, if they had the mental flexibility to address the situation systematically, and if they did not know what to do, if they knew how to access references or who they would reach out to in these situations. Because I wasn't looking for somebody that knew it all. We were looking for somebody that was willing to be flexible, because flexibility is key. Number two, who's willing to learn and can handle the pressure of situations. Because many nurses that did my interview would say, wow, that was pretty tough. But I wanted to really test them and see how they dealt with things under pressure, what their knowledge base was, and if they were willing to learn. If they had a thirst for learning, if they had that thirst for nursing, because nursing is ever evolving. You cannot pigeonhole yourself. And there's so much opportunity for us to advance as nurses, clinically, administratively, and on the academic side.
Sounds like you did your homework, and the assignment for the person sitting on the other side was, I hope they did their homework too, and came in ready to show you a little bit of what they know. But then also, I loved the fact that you said you weren't looking for somebody who knew everything, because I think sometimes when you're sitting on the other side and someone's like trying to pull out responses from you, or like you feel like, oh gosh, I just don't know everything. And to hear you say like, look, we're not looking for somebody who knows everything, but someone who knows how to go ask the right question or who to ask the question to. So thank you so much for that. That's such a great response. I will say earlier, we congratulated you on your retirement, but when we talked with you before this podcast episode, you were just telling us about all the things that you've been doing since you retired. So I really don't know if you've actually taken the pause that usually comes with retirement. It feels like you've just been keeping very busy. So what projects are you keeping up with now?
Okay, so true. As I said before, and I mentioned to you, Michael, before, I may be retired from military service, but I am not retired from nursing. When I retired, my wife and friends and family were saying, hey, you should take a break. I was approached with several opportunities. And so I agreed with my wife. I said, okay, I'll take a year off. I'll just try to be retired. And a friend of mine approached me. He says, hey, I'm running a group home. I need a nurse. And I said, okay, well, what does it entail? Because I've never done this group home stuff. There's a lot of administrative code from the state that deals with that. I read a lot of this stuff. I said, okay. Currently, I'm the director of nursing for a group home in Texas. And I'm responsible for the medical care of the residents, which means I'm responsible to make sure that they receive the proper referrals for care. If there's anything that happens during my time during the day and somebody's injured, the staff may call me, ensuring that individuals either directed to urgent care or the emergency department, doing comprehensive nursing assessments. So still using my assessment skills and working with physician and pharmacy providers to make sure and understanding the background of the residents to make sure that they receive what they need. Some of them have intellectual disabilities, some of them have physical disabilities. And I think my nursing experience allows me to engage the other providers and the staff in such a fashion that we can accomplish these things. And I realized I can have an impact here. And the other project that I ended up working on, my wife and another friend of ours who's a retired Army nurse, and another friend of ours who's a retired Air Force PA, we've been talking a few years about starting a clinic. It was our pastor's vision at our church for the clinic. He says, hey, you guys are the medical guys. You have all this experience. Just set it up. And that's the umbrella for the clinic. And I was able to, with the help of my wife, we came up with the entire equipment list for the clinic. Because when you're in the military, you have equipment lists that you use to facilitate the care of the patients. Also understanding the business of healthcare. Because, I have a master's in healthcare admin. And I learned that business while I was at the Shock Trauma Center, and also being in management and leading inpatient units and understanding these units from a business perspective, staff, supplies, and those fiscal responsibilities. We were able to set our clinic up in such a fashion that right now we're working out of a space, but everything's portable. So remember, CCAT, we take everything with us. So everything's portable. The strategic plan is once we get the space built out, then we can take the care to the people, which means all of this stuff that we ordered that's portable, that fits in 2 containers, we can put it in the back of a van and we can go to the people and provide them care. Our plan was to provide care to the uninsured, the underinsured, free of cost or low cost. And we're working with a health system of free clinics that are based out of Round Rock, Texas. We reach out to them. They set us up with their EMR. One of my capstones in grad school was deployment of EMRs in facilities. So having a familiarity with that, understanding how staff have to grasp this new tool in terms of documentation. We were able to set up our EMR. We were able to set up our flow from sign in to provider visit to follow up. So it's a free clinic. It's not a job. This is the calling. And as nurses, we've been doing this since Florence Nightingale, when I tell people she was the first informaticist, because she went into the situation, she assessed the entire situation, the environment of care, and said, look, we need to start changing these things, collected her data and said, here, this is what we need to do. Now we're working together to try to create a network of clinics for people. We will help them gain access to the system, which we know will help decompress our local emergency departments, because, as you know, a lot of patients end up at the emergency department because they don't have health care. So they come into the emergency department as their primary care provider, but that also causes bottlenecks sometimes and increases waiting times in emergency departments. So if we can get them access to the system without having to come to the emergency department, then we can save our emergency departments for those emergencies, for those traumas, for the disasters that may happen, and we can channel people into the system as they should be. And what I've learned from this experience is there's a lot of access that is available, either at no cost or income related, that people just don't know about. And once you learn these things, what we do as nurses, another thing we do as nurses, we teach. We educate our patients. We educate their families. So we work with our patients after they leave the clinic to guide them to the resources that they need. And I strongly believe we are responsible to make sure that we can provide the best care that we can, or the access for individuals that just can't seem to get there. I mean, I was at one of the other clinics, and there was a 90-year-old woman that came into the clinic that hadn't seen a physician in years. And she had a bag full of medication. And that happens in the ER. They show up, they got a bag full of stuff, and you're writing all of this stuff down. And then after they leave your emergency department, then what happens? What happens next? So when they leave us, we have an idea where they're going. And even if they come back, that's okay. But we don't turn anybody away. Yeah, we're appointment based. However, if somebody walks up, because we got a big flag on the side of the road that says clinic, and if people walk in, we don't turn them away. We will see them. That's what my wife and I say. There is always a way. And so what we focus on is finding the way after we take care of the medical necessities.
Well, that's really incredible that you have all of that going on. You certainly have not retired. I've realized that you have not retired. You have quite a bit that you're doing that's really inspiring. And I think it's always good to hear that there's people working in this regard, because I think a lot of emergency nurses, it's easy to get a little bit jaded towards the fact that there's repeat people in the ED and that there's a lack of community resources. And it's inspiring to find people that understand the ED perspective, but also understand the patient perspective, that some of these people are really trying with everything they know how to do the right thing. They just don't know where to turn. And to find somebody like yourself that is saying, you can turn to us and we'll help you navigate the system, I think is really commendable. So thank you for doing that. And the whole team that you're working with, that's awesome, and it's inspiring. And one thing that we love to ask everybody on this podcast is there a certain person in your career or a certain moment looking back that, whether it be watching the cardiac cath films or whether it be deploying to Korea and picking up that review manual, is there something that really impacted you as an individual or you as a nurse that you can look back and say that this particular person or this moment really changed the trajectory of what I was doing in life?
Yes, I would say a few moments because they're very pivotal. There was a patient I took care of at the trauma center, open abdomen, a lot of stuff. But I was taking care of this young man, and he was very critically ill. And I remember I would come in, and he was sedated. He was on the ventilator, but I would talk to him, because I think we all know this, that even when patients are sedated, they still may hear you. So I would talk to this young man every time I came in, good morning, it's me again. And, this is what we're going to be doing. And eventually he transferred to the step down. And typically after they go to progressive care, you may not see them again. A few weeks later, I was downstairs going to the cafeteria, and somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey. And I looked at this guy, nice dressed young man, said, hey, remember me? And I'm looking at him like, no. And he said, it's me. And he gave me his name. And I said, he said, you're my nurse. You took care of me. And I remember when you talked to me. And I looked at him. I said, he said, I'm getting ready to go to the outpatient clinic. I'm here for follow-up. And then he hugged me. He said, thanks. And that's all I needed.
Yeah.
That is worth more than all the money in the world. When one of your patients finds you and tells you as a nurse, thank you. You were my nurse. You took care of me. You took care of me. And that is so, it's important. And when people let you know that I feel cared for and I feel safe in your presence because you're my nurse, that's, for me, that's everything. That's everything.
Yeah, it is, man. And those moments when they happen, it's like a few minutes, right? But it impacts who you are in the future. It impacts some of the choices that you make. And on those days that are really, really hard, or you've had, a really tough shift, or maybe a poor patient outcome, and yet you remember and you reflect back on that moment and you're like, it's still worth it. It's still worth it. So thank you for sharing that with us. That's, again, just, it always moves my heart to hear what it is that moves us as professionals. And it oftentimes comes back to gratitude and holding ourselves and our character high so that we have the ability to take care of people and do it well. So I actually get the part of our podcast where I kind of change things up a little bit. We're going to ask a few rapid fire questions, and really they're just some of your favorites so that we can get to know you a little bit better. But if there was a career outside of healthcare, and I'll even go a bit to say outside of the military, what would it be? If there was a career that you'd like to try, what would it be?
I would say it'd have to be a technology career because I do have hobbies that involve gadgets as well. But I would do something in technology. Previously, I was looking at biomedical engineering because there was a connection of the clinical with the technical.
Mm.
And I like cars, so I'd probably be a mechanic.
I mean,
Cars are patients that don't really ask you for it.
I mean, and with the way that you're retiring, it sounds like you might have time for that too, So
That's one of my hobbies too. I have a car that I work on.
Of course you do. You gotta stay busy. All right, 3 categories of favorites. Here we go. Favorite book.
Favorite book, Lord of the Flies.
All right. I haven't read that one in a while, but honestly, when I read it as a kid, I was like, what is this all about? And then when I read it when I was a little older, I was like, I know exactly what this is about. So that's a kind of a throwback, but I like it. All right. Favorite movie, TV show, or it can be like a binge-worthy series, something that you'd recommend for us to dive into.
Okay. Which Star Wars series would you like?
All the Wars of the Stars. Yes, all of them.
All 9 episodes, but the series that I like in Star Wars is Mandalorian. So I'm a sci-fi buff. I am a nerd. I was in the Star Wars trivia game on May the 4th, and I didn't win, but I placed well. And I like, outside of the sci-fi, I like a good detective series.
I know a lot of nurses who love the detective stuff. And I think it's because our assessment skills are super honed and we're used to I think this person may not be telling me the whole truth. And I feel like our lie barometer is pretty good. So I don't know if I'll ever be involved in a real case. I do solve some of those box crime games. I do those pretty often. But if I'm ever called upon, I'll be like, yes, sir, I will sit in on the interview and I'll give you my read on this whole situation.
Remember the TV series ER when it came on many, many years ago? That was my favorite medical show. Mm-hmm. Now, when you look at a medical show, I'm like, what are all these doctors doing in the code? What are they're always starting IVs. What are they doing?
They're always starting IVs and doing compressions. And I'm like, I haven't seen that in real life.
By the time they show up, and I did explain it to one provider. I was like, Doc, look, when I work, any place I've worked, typically, especially on a trauma ICU or in any trauma center, by the time you show up, we've already given an epi and done some stuff because it's part of our protocols.
And sometimes they're spread a little thin on that night shift. You gotta get started.
And my wife usually tells me when we're looking at a medical show, she won't watch it with me because I'm like, no, that's wrong. That's wrong. I'm like, well, that's probably what's going on with them. And she's like, would you be quiet so we can just enjoy the TV show? So it's hard to not be technical with some of these TV shows. So I'm like, you know what? Somebody needs a nurse to be their advisor.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes the equipment that they use, I'm like, that is not what that is for. I'm like, wrong. But we could stay on this all day. Okay, moving on. Favorite musical artist, or it can even be a genre of music that you really appreciate.
Jimmy Smith. He's a jazz organist. He played a Hammond B3 organ, and he was one of the fathers of acid jazz, blues, good guitar playing. One of my favorite artists is Prince. I've been to Paisley Park twice, but he's my favorite musician. Just bottom line, Jimmy Smith, because I like the way that he took an instrument that you would hear in church. And this guy really played a lot of good jazz on it. Those are my 2 favorite single artists.
All right. This is another good question, especially for someone who keeps himself rather occupied with many things. But what is kind of a self-care go-to or a hobby outside of healthcare that helps you reset, kind of get back to yourself so that way you can give the 110% that you give?
I like working in my yard. As a matter of fact, I got a 70-inch planter box that I'm going to be assembling probably today and tomorrow. And we're planting a garden in the backyard.
Not surprised at all.
Yeah. So, and that's because as a kid, we had a garden in our backyard, and it just kind of carries over. And my wife has already started some of the tomato plants. So I guess I got to put them in the ground now, in the dirt. And I still continue to exercise, not to the level that I did in the military, but that's always been a stress reliever, especially after, when you work, if you're doing a bunch of 12s and you need to decompress, it's a good way to clear your head. So honestly, as a person who kind of pressed the human factors envelope, one time I was involved in an exercise and I pushed it way past the 12-hour mark, and I got in a car accident. I was tired. So you have to decompress. You have to recover yourself. You have to have something that you do outside of nursing. You have to switch the channel to something else for a little while and then come back to it. Because if you don't, you will experience burnout.
Yeah.
We've lost a lot of really good nurses, and there are extremely talented nurses. Especially what COVID did was expose a lot of extremely talented nurses, because during COVID, we had to figure some stuff out, especially at the bedside. Nurses make stuff happen. We make stuff happen.
That's right. But I agree with you that in order for us to stay creative, to stay in that kind of forward thinking, we got to take care of ourselves too. So I tell you what, if our audience wants to follow you online, is there a social media platform or somewhere that they could reach out to you?
I am on Facebook and LinkedIn. Primarily, those are the two social media platforms I use.
Well, I think that that's extremely important to have that balance. And, I tell Holly all the time, every time I think I've done something good with my career, I meet people like Lionel or somebody else, and I realize that I've barely scraped the surface. And there's people like you that are just so far advanced. And being able to talk to you, being able to hear from your experiences and all the things you've done, it's just really inspiring and incredible to meet an individual like yourself. So again, thank you for your military service, but I think even on a broader range, thank you for all that you've done to impact other nurses and other patients around the world, both within the military and outside of it. I think you're a real inspiration, Lionel, and it's been an honor to have this podcast with you today.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Holly, for the opportunity to be able to share. And I truly appreciate it. I thank you for your support. And I'm sure all of our military members, thank you for your support, because if it wasn't for the support of our family, friends, and colleagues, we would not be able to do what we do, where we do it, and when we do it. And it's good to know that we have the support. And also, certification is important. It expands your knowledge. It will keep that thirst and keep you relevant. So I strongly suggest to nurses, if you decide to become an emergency nurse or do trauma or do critical care, I strongly encourage that they seek certification, because it will help you master your craft.
Well, I want to take this time to thank Lionel for joining us for this episode of BCEN and Friends. Thank you, Lionel, for sharing your experiences, your expertise, your continued passion for nursing and for patients, your drive to improve the quality of life for those who often get lost in the shuffle of healthcare. It's not only admirable, it's also inspiring. And I think that you might be redefining what it means to retire. We truly appreciate you and all that you are doing. And to all of our listeners, we hope you will stay tuned as we continue with BCEN and Friends and bring you new, meaningful content and perspectives. If you have a suggestion for an episode, please email us at bcn@bcn.org. I'm Holly Briggs here with Michael Dexter, and on behalf of the entire BCEN team, we thank and celebrate you for all that you're doing as professional nurses across the emergency spectrum. Until next time, we are out.